Thank you. Thank you. It's a little embarrassing when the applause you get before you speak are more enthusiastic than the applause you get after you speak. I want to talk about empire, because that's a hot subject. It's okay if I talk about empire? There's really an enormous disparity between what empires actually do and the way they're represented in history by their leaders and their apologists and their chroniclers. Empires are presented to us, believe it or not, as creations of peace. They're even given names of peace. Pax Romana, Pax Britannica, and we even hear of Pax Americana. Empires are represented as bringing stability, justice, and prosperity to their subject peoples. They're often represented as selfless things. Can you hear me all right? I don't feel like I'm getting picked up. Is that? Here we are. As selfless organizations that bring order where there's disorder. Let me quote a great scholar of empire, Edward Gibbon, his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. This is the way he describes Rome of a certain period. The obedience of the Roman world was uniform, voluntary, and permanent. The vanquished nations, blended into one great people, resigned the hope, even the wish of resuming their independence. The vast Roman Empire was governed by absolute power under the guidance of virtue and wisdom. Yeah, right. Not a word here. Not a word about an empire of shattered armies, sacked towns, raped women, enslaved prisoners of war, oppressively overtaxed populations, burned crops, slaughtered herds, and so forth. Not a word about that. Let me give you the quote of an English political leader and writer of the 19th century named John Morley, speaking about the British Empire. 1877. We have had imposed upon us by the unlucky prowess of our ancestors the task of ruling millions of alien dependents. We undertake it with a disinterestedness and execute it with a skill of administration to which history supplies no parallel. I mean, don't hold back, John, in self-praise here. But you see the word, you see the words. We have had imposed upon us by the unlucky prowess of our ancestors. They were so strong and out there, they just went out and gobbled up land, and now we're stuck with this big old empire. Millions, actually it's a vast number of millions of alien dependents. They're dependent on us. All these little brown people and such, all these people in these odd, strange, exotic places, they're dependent upon us. Poor things. I mean, they're like children. They need our guidance and our administrative wisdom. So the literature is really very self-congratulatory. And I'm surprised at how little critical comment it's aroused. I mean, you're hearing some of it tonight. But in the literature, it's amazing. Empires are sometimes represented as unintentional conglomerates. I think Morley's quote, the one I just read, is a perfect example of that. Unintentional. The product of unconscious circumstance. When I was a youth, I used to hear, and some of you have heard this phrase, right? The British Empire was formed in a fit of absent-mindedness, or in a state of absent-mindedness. It was put together. Cyril Robinson, a British historian, significantly, he's a classicist. I take him to task, him among a small army of other historians in my book, The Assassination of Julius Caesar. And this is a quote from the book. His expertise is ancient Rome, and he says the same thing. He says, it was perhaps almost as true of Rome as of Great Britain that she acquired her world domination in a fit of absence of mind. No, Cyril, you got the fit of absence of mind. And we hear it today about the United States also. we hear that the United States was reluctantly thrust into the role of world leader. We found ourselves, this responsibility and obligation has been put upon us. They never say who did all the putting upon and all the thrusting. It's just sort of something that happened. In fact, it's a product of deliberate manipulation and contrivance and a very systematic force and interest involved, as I shall try to argue tonight. Americans have always been taught that empire and imperialism is the process of empire. That's what empires do, imperialism. We've always been taught that this is something that other countries do. When I was in the 6th grade, my 6th grade teacher, Grace A. Myers, I remember, she said to me, the United States is the only advanced country that doesn't have any colonies. And in those days, we had Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, Puerto Rico. The Philippines was just given, hadn't been given independence yet. We had a bunch of colonies, but, and she said, no, those are called territories or possessions. They're not called colonies. So a lot depends on labeling. Labeling is a very powerful thing in politics, as you know. In recent years, however, it's become rather acceptable to refer to the U.S. as an empire. When I wrote my book, Against Empire, some years ago, a few people come and say, oh, empire, aren't you overstating it? Aren't you overdoing it? It wasn't too long later, a few years later maybe, there are all these books coming out. The Sorrow of Empire, The Folly of Empire, the Challenge of Empire, American Empire, and so forth. It's become really a hot term. Everybody's talking. Even conservative pundits on TV will now say, and push it. They'll even say, they say, we're the strongest nation in the world and we have every right to act as such. We're an empire with all the obligations and responsibilities and opportunities of an empire, and we better get used to it. These are practically near quotes from this or that conservative pundit that I've heard who overpopulate our media, their media. There's always this thing about, and again, it's always this, it's an impersonal force. No explanation how this happened to happen, you know. It's an impersonal force that stuff just happens, and this is where we are now. And it's a mantle that's been thrown upon our shoulders by history. And to maintain our credibility as a great power, we have to act like a great power, which means acting imperialistically. So the communists were right. We're imperialists. They used to say that for years, and we say, commie propaganda. But we should have paid more attention. Now, one of the other things I noticed in the whole literature on empire is people rarely, and there's some exceptions now, finally, some people are beginning to read what we've been writing for some years, and they're saying it. But for the longest time, you could look at the literature and histories on empire, and they never explain why. Why is there an empire? They'll describe them. The Mongol Empire, the Roman Empire, the British Empire, the Japanese Empire, that most vicious and evil and relentless power crazed of all empires, most aggressive, most ruthless, most brutal, the Soviet Empire, which just went away in a few years, and people demonstrated and all that. Supposedly it was the most power hungry. And it's never said, why? Why do empires come along? Why do people build empires? It takes a lot of purposive and conscious effort to build an empire. Why all this conquest? Is it conquest just for conquest? Power for power's sake? Actually, there are very real material interests involved in empire. There's plunder, there's tribute, there are resources, there are markets, there's expropriating the land, the crops, the cheap labor, and in the case of Rome, the slave labor. Empires are enormously profitable and they're enormously costly. they cost more than they bring in. But it doesn't matter, because the profits go to one group and the costs go to another group. The empires are very profitable for their ruling elites and interests. And empires are enormously costly for the common populace of the imperial nation. The empire feeds off the resources of the republic. You can see that today. $200 billion allocated, 120 billion spent, but 200 all told allocated for Iraq. That's $200 billion of our money. That's $200 billion less of rebuilding infrastructure, human services, health care, education, and all those other marginal frills. All that money going, and yet, of course, enormous multi-billion-dollar contracts for Halliburton, Bechtel, and an enormous repository of oil for the U.S. oil cartels. So the people pay the taxes and do without the services so that the patricians can pursue their far-off plunder. The center is bled so that the periphery can continue to expand and expand. E. Badian, speaking of Rome's imperial class, he wrote, "No administration in history has ever devoted itself so wholeheartedly to fleecing its subjects for the private benefit of its ruling class as Rome of the late Republic." Of course, he was writing several decades before the present administration here in the U.S. The difference between what Americans think their country is doing in the world and what the U.S. rulers really are doing in the world is one of the great propaganda achievements of modern history. Most people in this country would be absolutely astonished to hear what I'm saying. Most of them wouldn't, many of them wouldn't even come in. I mean, they would just sit there and say, "What? I never heard that on Fox. What? What are you saying?" Many of them would be outraged to hear it. Many of them would just simply say, "Oh, you hate America. You're criticizing America." That's what the book Super Patriotism is about, how you can't criticize without being called a hater of America. That's one of the themes that I deal with critically. When there is some awareness that things aren't going well, then U.S. policy is still passed off, as in Vietnam, as in Iraq. It's still passed off as well-intentioned, but just not successful. Overextended, honestly confused, ill-informed. We thought there were weapons of mass destruction. We just got bad data. The CIA, for some reason, just got it all wrong that time. And what a coincidence, the British intelligence just got it all wrong for Tony Blair at about the same time. Gee, stuff like that happens. What a coincidence, duh. The intelligence information just wasn't that good. They never explained, why wouldn't the intelligence information be that good? What are you talking about? You had all sorts of other groups. You had the UN going in there. You had all sorts of reports written saying the opposite. You kept sending it back to cook it, asking them to cook it up, cook it for Iraq. That's really closer to the truth. Now, I'm one of those who believe that U.S. foreign policy is not foolish. It's not stupid. It's not led by stupid men. The guy in the White House is a crafty, resourceful, conniving, lying, hypocritical, scoundrel with all the intelligence of a rat. He has a polemical instinct and he knows what the hell he's doing. And if you want to get some gratification out of joking about how stupid he is, he's so stupid, when he's sticking it up you one side and down the other, you better wake up. So we should give less attention. We should give less attention to how stupid this conniving, failed businessman, cokehead, reformed alcoholic, yelly snot is, and we should see how vicious and relentless he is in the pursuit of his interests. I shouldn't hold back, should I? I don't know what it is. I think U.S. foreign policy is remarkably resourceful and successful. It's one of the most effective and brilliantly ruthless policies in the history of empires. I am now going to read to you all its victories. The history of U.S. foreign policy, not all the victories. Actually, I don't have comprehensive, extended list. These are just things that came into my memory on the plane. And it only goes from after World War II, okay? And there were things way before that. U.S. foreign policy after World War II is a history of bloody, repressive, and successful interventions. U.S. leaders profess a dedication to democracy, yet over the last 50 years, U.S. national security state has been a key force in overthrowing reformist democratic governments in Guatemala, Guyana, the Dominican Republic, Brazil, Chile, Uruguay, Syria, Indonesia under Sukarno, Greece twice, Argentina twice, Haiti twice, Haiti 3 times if you count a couple of months ago, Bolivia, and other countries, and replaced them in each instance with pro-capitalist military regimes that opened their resources, their markets, and their cheap labor to U.S. corporate investors on terms completely favorable to the investors, who integrated themselves into the free market global system. U.S. leaders having actively pursued covert actions or proxy mercenary wars against popular revolutionary governments in Cuba, Angola, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Portugal, South Yemen, Nicaragua, Cambodia, East Timor, Western Sahara, Iraq, and elsewhere. Iraq, now there's a story that's never told, never mentioned. Never mentioned. All the talk on Iraq, and never mentioned, is the fact that the Iraqis, who the present leadership presumes needs education in democracy, the Iraqis had a wide-based coalition democratic revolution back in 1968, wasn't it? Or so. And took over and had a wonderful government, nationalized the oil industry, kicked out the English oil companies, kicked out the American oil companies. And it was the U.S. and the CIA that backed the Ba'athist Party, the conservative wing of the Ba'athist Party, and Saddam Hussein, who went in there and they overthrew and they murdered and they tortured and they killed those democratic forces. That's never mentioned. That Saddam Hussein was Washington's poster boy for years, during the years when he was doing his worst and ruthless torture and murder and killings. Brutal, horrible things he was doing. And he was being paid, advised, and supported by the CIA and the U.S. national security state. That's never mentioned. That's been dropped down the memory hole. And it's only afterwards, when he started committing economic nationalism, that they started not liking him. When he started asking for a better break on the oil quotas, that's when they decided they really didn't need him. When he nationalized the whole economy and started health and education programs in limited ways and all that, that's when Saddam Hussein suddenly became a dictator. U.S. rulers have actively destabilized and moved against reformist governments in Egypt, Lebanon, Peru, Iran under Mossadegh, Syria, Zaire under Patrice Lumumba, Jamaica under Michael Manley, Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, the Fiji Islands, Afghanistan before the Soviets ever went into the country. Pakistani and U.S. intelligence were already in there destabilizing the military that was in power because it was a left reformist military. Since World War II, U.S. direct military invasion with U.S. forces invading or launching aerial attacks, bombings, or both against Vietnam, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, North Korea, Laos, Cambodia, Yugoslavia, Lebanon, Grenada, Panama, Libya, Iraq twice, Somalia. Now, there's no rogue state. There's no axis of evil. There's no communist country that has a record of aggression like the one I just read off. And this is an incomplete listing I've given you here. The cost, 10,000 killed in Somalia. Hundreds of thousands have been killed in Iraq since the first Gulf War because of direct bombings and sanctions. I was in Iraq in November 2000. I was there just for the week and a half I was there. This was before, there was no war at that time. A school was hit by U.S. planes, and 4 students were badly maimed and 2 teachers were killed. Just in that 1 week. And this went on. This was going on. To say the war began in March 2003 is wrong. It never had really stopped. The bombings had been going on all through that decade under Clinton also. 3 million people killed in Vietnam, 200,000 still missing, 500,000 in Laos, 1 million in Indonesia in the US-sponsored coup against Sukarno, 300,000 killed in East Timor by that deranged murder machine known as the Indonesian army, paid, equipped, advised, trained, supplied by the United States. 80,000 killed in El Salvador. Guatemala, finally acknowledged in the New York Times, 205,000 killed by the death squads and extermination programs by General Monte, who wiped out 600 Mayan villages. Clinton went down there 25 years later, right? And he apologized. I mean, how do you apologize for 205,000 killings? And what about the people who survive, who will never be the same, who live with the nightmares and horrors? What you kill is not only a portion of the population, you kill the country's future. You destroy it and you whack it and you damp it down. And he apologized. I mean, how do you do that? You know, I kill all of you and I say, all right, I'm sorry. I feel your pain. And one could go on. Look also at the fact that U.S. power has never been used to assist popular reformist governments or revolutionary movements or governments in any of these countries. U.S. power has never been used to assist broad, mass-based, revolutionary, democratic agitation, the democratic revolutions and overthrows in Chile and in when the democracy and the people came back into the streets and fought back. The U.S. never gave them any kind of help. There's not a case where you can say that the U.S. helped. Not in Guatemala, not in Nicaragua, not in Palestine or Lebanon, not in South Africa, not in South Korea, not anywhere. Not in China, until China opened its economy to massive private investment with millions of Chinese workers laboring without a contract and without protections 12 hours a day for miserable pay. Not until China started privatizing and dismantling much of its public services. And same with Vietnam. With Vietnam doing this pretty much the same as China now, suddenly the U.S. is friendlier to Vietnam. It's no longer a pariah nation. And so with Libya, I mean, do you really think the U.S. policy is changing toward Libya because Libya said, well, we're not going to do any weapons of mass destruction? Give me a break. There's about 40, 50 countries who've got programs of one sort or another here. That isn't what they opposed in Libya. It's that Colonel Gaddafi led a revolution in Libya that took a country that had a social structure like Saudi Arabia with a few obscenely rich families at the top, kicked them out, nationalized the oil industry. And you shouldn't worry if they nationalize the oil. They still want to sell it to you. You often hear our politicians say, we need that oil. We need it. You'll need it for your car and all that, to try to create a false community of interest. They'll sell you the oil. What do you think they're going to do with it? Iran is eager to sell oil. Iraq was always eager to sell oil to us. It's not that. It's not that the oil cartels want to buy their oil and then sell it to you with a good marked up profit. It's that they want to own that oil themselves and then sell it to you and reap all of the earnings from it. And Libya took over that oil industry, and Gaddafi went in there and he planted 40 million trees for reforestation programs, and he started education and health programs and housing programs and all sorts of other things. Women could go to school for the first time in Libyan history. I mean, go to advanced professional school, even military school, and the like. That's when Libya became a pariah nation. And Libya today is now being welcomed back by Tony Blair and George Bush because Gaddafi is finally giving in. The sanctions have been just too hard on this country, and he's saying, okay, we'll open it up to Western investment. That's what's been the change, and suddenly Libya is suddenly coming to be an okay nation, maybe. For additional consistent patterns, look at the regimes that U.S. rulers have supported. The ones most likely to win U.S. favor are those that are integrated into the global system of free market corporate domination. They're called pro-American, pro-West. That's a buzzword for global free market. The ones that leave their economies open to foreign penetration on terms that are singularly favorable to the transnationals. Privatized, deregulated investment. The ones that adopt a neoliberal mode of maldevelopment which starves out the public sector. Mostly right-wing or right-wing moving client states. That's what makes them right-wing, is doing those kind of things. Free market, against the public sector and like. That's what right means. And left means using a public sector, reforms, human services, equalizing, redistributive politics. That's what those terms right and left mean. They have a very real class content. They're almost never defined in America. And in fact, it's very interesting to how those labels are always thrown around, and yet the content of them are almost never discussed. It's rather remarkable if you listen to what passes for political discussion in our media. Such countries as Chile under Pinochet, the Philippines under Marcos, Zaire under Mobutu. That Mobutu stole about $4 billion out of Zaire. He stripped that, now the Congo, Republic of the Congo. He stripped it. He died with $4 billion. That was his whole life, was to be this kind of blood-sucking parasite, a comprador leader, sycophant, follower of the U.S. global empire, and so that he could do what they wanted, so he could rip off all that he wanted. Egypt under Sadat, Peru under Fujimori, South Africa under apartheid, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait under feudalism, Turkey, Pakistan, Nigeria under police state autocracies. Let's look at the role of the U.S. empire in Africa, because Africa is not all that often discussed. When progressive critics in America discuss the U.S. empire critically, they usually focus on Latin America, which has been historically. But Africa, the story in Africa is really something. Through the World Bank and the IMF, U.S. leaders have demolished African economies, including their public health and education sectors. You know what it is. You're in a debt now. You have to pay your debt. You got to produce more and spend less. Spend less, you got to squeeze on your health programs, your education, cut back on all those things so that you can pay your debt. Your debt keeps accumulating with interest, and you get trapped deeper and deeper. Most African nations have sunk into a debt structure that leaves them in peonage to Western investors. U.S. leaders also have fueled 11 wars on the African continent since 1950. Resulting in the death of some 7 million people in Africa, with millions more facing starvation and an ever-deepening poverty. That's why the Africans are so poor. It's not that they can't get it together. It's not that they don't know how to raise herds and raise crops and use the land. They've been doing it for thousands of years before the white colonizers came there. It's because of the way they've been ravaged and stripped and forced down today. Washington has given arms and military training to 50 African countries. That is, to the ruling elites and thugs who ruled in 50 different countries. There's only 53 countries in all of Africa. So you see how they try to lock down a whole continent. All of this has helped Africa to become the most war-torn region in the world. The more war-ravaged, the more poverty-stricken that the African nations become, the more ready they are to sell their labor and their abundant natural resources at rock-bottom prices to the U.S. and other investors. Almost 80% of the strategic minerals that the U.S. requires are extracted from Africa. Cobalt, platinum, gold, chromium, manganese, uranium, ingredients needed to make jet engines, automotive vehicles, missiles, electronic components, and other things. Africa also accounts for 18% of U.S. oil imports as compared to 25% from the Middle East, and new reserves are being discovered, are yet to be tapped. There's a policy group. Washington, D.C. is honeycombed with what are called policy groups, some of them semi-official. There's one that's called the African Oil Policy Initiative Group. It announced that Washington intends to establish a permanent U.S. regional military command structure in Africa, quote, which could produce significant dividends in the protection of U.S. investments. This African Oil Policy Initiative Group is made up of U.S. oil companies, some foreign consultants, members of Congress, and representatives from the Bush administration. Semi-official indeed. Well, you know, in the old days, they used to give you a glass to drink water from. You know, it's so undignified to have to swig out of a bottle in front of all these people. Hey, so how am I doing? All right? Hey, so what's happening? Okay. Now, all these lists, all these countries that I mentioned, these are all victories for the U.S. empire. It's true in some cases you see a heartening thing, though. You see in Chile the resurgence of democratic forces, so Pinochet is kicked out. You see him being hounded now for his crimes against humanity. You see that happening all over the world. It's a marvelous development, the International Criminal Court, where the nations of the world, not because these leaders are suddenly so regenerated, it's because of the force and the pressure from the people below them. The nations of the world are now saying crimes against humanity shall be prosecuted against anyone who commits a crime anywhere. And that's a rather extraordinary new development. And the U.S. is totally for it. It's not true they're against it. They're for it, except that U.S. military and governmental personnel have to be excluded from it. Otherwise, they're before it. So it's the arrogance of empire, of course, that we are above. We are above the ordinary rules that govern ordinary people. Now, these lists are not just something I have confected out of my own imagination. All of this that I've been saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, all of this is a matter of public record. Although, admittedly, some parts of the public record are more public than other parts. Some parts just fall away. But it's not enough to denounce these actions. We also have to try to explain them. If we're to believe U.S. leaders, you know, and since the empire feeds off the republic, you can't tell the republic that we just do this for the power and wealth of the few at the top. You say we go in there to fight a tyranny, we go in to teach democracy, we go in to stop a threat to our own security, that's the most effective one, to fight terrorism and the like. Well, I say otherwise. I say they go in to maximize this free market global empire. But how do you know that? I mean, how do you know? Because what we're talking about here is a profession of intent, of motive. What is the motive behind U.S. policy? What are the motives? They say their motives are so honorable, humanitarian, and so elevating. I say they're so venile and self-interested and plundering. The problem with determining motives is that no one has ever seen a motive or an intent. It's a non-empirical thing. You can't say there's an intent or a motive. Intent is something that's always ascribed or inferred or imputed, whatever. And so, I mean, Bush Sr. can't deny he invaded Panama, but he can profess certain motives. He said, I'm so upset by the drug trade and Noriega's involvement in it, that's why I went into Panama. But in fact, Panama, you know, had a left military under Torrio. It had all these reform programs. And after Bush went in, after the U.S. Army went into Panama, all those programs were shattered. Unemployment went up about 80%, higher than it had been before. All the redistributive politics and policies that this left military was doing were abolished. The Panamanian Army itself was abolished. So you can raise questions about the motive. You can say, gee, there's drug dealers in all these other countries. Guatemala, just about every Latin American country. There are military and top political leaders involved in the international cocaine trade. And suddenly, Panama? You're so upset just about Panama. So there are ways in which you can question the motive when you see certain odd inconsistencies. There are ways in which you can ascribe motive with some degree of reliability when you see these consistent patterns, as I've just been trying to show you. The kinds of countries that the U.S. have supported and political movements, the kinds that they have opposed, specifically again and again. So when U.S. rulers say they're attacking Iraq because of its links to al-Qaeda or its weapons of mass destruction, you can make, in that case, an empirical refutation. When U.S. rulers say they're bombing Yugoslavia, and I treat this question in my book, To Kill a Nation, they're bombing Yugoslavia to stop the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, we can see that the mass exodus in Kosovo began after the bombing started. And it involved not only Albanians, but Serbs themselves, all of them trying to get away from the bombings. And these refugees said they fled because of the bombings by NATO. And when U.S. rulers say they bombed Yugoslavia because they had to stop the genocidal slaughter of 100,000 Albanians, and then even the Wall Street Journal runs an investigation and says, there's no 100,000 bodies, they haven't found any bodies. The Trepka mines had no bodies. They talked about the mine shafts being filled with bodies. They went there, they found nothing, not a shoe, not a belt buckle, not a bone, nothing. The bodies didn't materialize. They found a couple of thousand bodies in Kosovo, an area of what, 20 million people. Of course you're going to have bodies. People died from unspecified nationalities. There had been some fighting and there had been killing, obviously. The Serbs were ready and eager to pursue peace in Kosovo. It was to their advantage. And the KLA was ready and eager to pursue war because they knew they would bring NATO in at their backs. So there are ways that you can check the professions and the pretenses. You see repeatable patterns and consistencies, and that's how you determine motives. As I said, you observe that any leader or political movement that attempts to depart from the free market global system, that pursues any kind of redistributive politics for the general populace, that attempts to use or advocates using its land, labor, capital, and markets and natural resources in self-developing and self-defining ways, any such leader or movement is subjected to demonization. denigrated as a brutal tyrant or tyranny. He's called corrupt, oppressive, belligerent, a threat to stability and regional security, a drug trafficker, or just inexplicably anti-American or anti-West. Most recently, you hear this about what? Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. I've yet to see a New York Times story about Hugo Chavez, which doesn't use the word mercurial. The mercurial leader, like he's just ay caramba, you know. The other day in the San Francisco Chronicle, I heard him described as, what was it? Pugnacious. Pugnacious was the word. The pugnacious leader. Pugnacious means fighting, really looking for fights. He isn't looking for fights. He keeps calling for friendly relations. In Yugoslavia, I saw Milosevic demonized, elected president, elected by the people of Yugoslavia. Four-party coalition he presided over. I was in Yugoslavia in July '99, right after the bombing stopped, and I kept reading about Milosevic, the dictator. And there I was going along, and there's all these posters of opposition parties against Milosevic and all that, right? A police state, a brutal police state. And I couldn't find any police around. I mean, you go to Mexico City, on every block, every corner, there's a cop. You go to Belgrade, and I couldn't find cops. I think I was there my third or fourth day. I saw two policemen walk by, with no armor or anything, just little caps on and little guns and whistles. But Yugoslavia had 80% of its economy was publicly owned. It had public health services, free education, and medical care. All of that's been privatized. Yugoslavia has been broken up into a cluster of little right-wing republics where everything has been deregulated and privatized, where unemployment has gone up 20, 30 to 50%. It varies from Macedonia to Kosovo to Croatia, other places, where things have been deindustrialized. It was a country that was too independent. It didn't want to join the European Union. It didn't want to become part of NATO. It had no interest. And now it's learning its lesson. And those people have been branded and demonized as war criminals. By the way, the Serbs did commit war crimes, but so did the Croatians, so did the Bosnians, and so did the KLA Albanians. The KLA Albanians killed, among the people they killed was some of their fellow Albanians who wanted to stay in the Yugoslav Federation. Those were the first people they went after. We also hear that those who target, or rather those who are targeted by our rulers, our enemies, quote, enemies out there, are people who are impelled by evil impulses. Now that's our president-select who said those things. That he talked about the rulers of Iraq as evil, and they're anti-American. We hear that the terrorists hate us because we are free and prosperous and democratic and secular, and those are all things they just hate. They just hate it. They're just so envious. I heard Dan Rathers, that genius, I heard Dan Rathers say, they hate us because we are winners and they are losers. Yeah, that sort of thing. Well, in my book, Super Patriotism, I have a couple of pages in there. I actually took the trouble to go see what it is these terrorists actually do say about us. I just somehow couldn't trust Bill O'Reilly and Dan Rathers and all those other guys. I just couldn't quite put my faith in them. I read, for instance, the comments made by the group that bombed the World Trade Center in 1993, which killed about 100 people or so. They're all in jail. And then I read a number of statements by Osama bin Laden. And this is what they said. You give unqualified support to Israel. You're destroying our popular movements and countries. You're destroying, undermining our cultures. You're stealing our resources. You come in and occupy us and try to run our lives. If you leave us alone, we will leave you alone. Since I wrote the book, Osama bin Laden has just issued another statement very similar to that. And you know, the dominant thrust is this propaganda, this whole climate of opinion that's created, that just keeps going out there, is such that they don't suppress his comment. They show his comment. And then don't make a thing of it. This is what Osama bin Laden is saying. And you hear what he says, and you say, wait a minute. And then it just goes, that's all. It's assumed that, isn't this amusing, isn't this deceptive, isn't this irrelevant, because we know what this guy really is. He said, this war we're waging is a retaliatory war. It's not our initiative. If you leave us alone, we will leave you alone. Let's declare a truce in Iraq. You go home, and we'll never bother you again. Now the problem, of course, another thing when trying to determine intent, which is another way of trying to determine causality, which is a scientific problem, we can't test. You can't test history and you can't test politics. All we have is observation. But you can build a science on observation. There are some sciences that have no testing, or very little. There may be some developed now. Astronomy, for one. Ironically, one of the most successful sciences. All its basic laws were worked out 2,500 years ago by the Greeks and Romans, who knew all this. And then it all got suppressed by the Christians for about the better part of 1,000 years. And then Galileo and Copernicus started revising it again. And it was shocking. How could you even think that? But I mean, that was all. Copernicus and Galileo didn't, I mean, of course they had the discovery of the telescope and they could do new things. But that science was its basic laws were just by sheer observation without telescopes. They worked out all these things. That's why those stars are named Venus, Mars, Pluto, Jupiter, Mercury. You see? They're not called Mark, Matthew, Luke, St. Paul. There are times, however, when history can provide a laboratory test. For instance, for decades we were told that the United States needed enormous military budgets and a whole global network of military bases around the world in order to contain the Soviet communist menace that was an aggrandizing, expanding force, and that threatened to encircle and devour us. U.S. militarism, in other words, was an innocent, reactive necessity born of communist aggression. Some of us at that time argued otherwise. I did in a very early book called The Anti-Communist Impulse, which is totally out of print. Don't ask me. I don't know where you can get a copy. But we argued that were the Soviet Union to disappear, the U.S. would still pursue a policy of imperialistic domination because it had these imperialist interests that I've been talking about all evening. Well, as I said, history can make its own laboratory test. Here was a case where you actually suddenly did remove one of the variables from the equation and you could test for it, hold it constant. The Soviet Union did disappear. And what do we have today? The U.S. global empire has disappeared, hasn't it? No, it hasn't. We have a U.S. military budget bigger than ever, growing at a faster rate than during the Cold War. Think about that. All the Cold War weapons programs were continued. All the military bases abroad were kept. Just about almost all of them. New military bases have been established in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. The U.S. has pursued wars of intervention and control more violently and more frequently than ever, and a host of new enemies have been conjured up. So, there you have it. I pretty much said everything that I'm going to say. You can determine intent then by seeing these patterns of behavior and the enormous consistency behind them. It's not true that U.S. policy is inconsistent and confused. It's enormously well-directed and developed in that way. There are those who say, oh, you're being reductionist, you're reducing it all to just economic interests, and what about questions of ideology? What about strategic considerations? What about that? But questions of ideology have a class basis to them. Strategic interests are determined. When you say you have a strategic interest, I mean, what is a strategic interest? A nation has a strategic interest in a region because the region has some value to it, or because the region has entree to another region that has some value. So it's a backup or something. And often that value is the economic resources or the class control considerations. Consider Iraq. There are three basic reasons for U.S. intervention in Iraq. And these are the same three basic reasons that dictate U.S. interventions most elsewhere. There's first the systemic monopoly that we've been talking about, the need to maintain and impose a global free market system. Iraq had an economy that was completely publicly owned. Donald Rumsfeld, that genius who was Secretary of Defense, I was rather amused and fascinated by his use of terminology. He said Iraq has a Stalinized economy. I mean, it's really stoking up the old imagery. Iraq was self-defining, self-developing, not completely a free market client state. Second, Iraq also was a bad example to other countries in the region that might want to be self-defining. That's the same reason the U.S. invaded Grenada, remember, in the Caribbean. Ronald Reagan was right. Ronald Reagan, the conqueror of Grenada, a nation of 102,000 people, he said, it's not the nutmeg. It's true. The U.S. can get perfectly good nutmeg from Africa, high-quality nutmeg from Africa. They don't need Grenada's nutmeg. We went in there. Well, why the hell did we go into Grenada? It was to serve notice to every other nation in the Caribbean that if you try this course, this is what will come down on you. If you get rid of these corrupt comprador leaders who are our buddies and open up your country to us, if you start doing these other kinds of subversive things like health care programs and new farming cooperative programs and all that, this is what you're going to get. And today, Grenada unemployment is up 40% since the U.S. invasion. And those farming cooperatives have been turned into golf courses for the rich tourists. And poverty and misery is again down there. And the poorer you can keep people, the hungrier you can keep them, the harder they will work for less and less. And the richer I get, the more they'll turn over their country to you. So Iraq was a bad example. Iraq could emerge as a regional power. Iraq had the highest standard of living in the Middle East. Iraq was taking a different course. Other countries might get the same idea. And we've served notice in the Middle East that this is what's going to happen to you. And they've served notice now, and this is what's going to happen to you by coming in with now a resistance movement and fighting back here. Third, in the case of Iraq, there's that straight old colonization resource plunder consideration. Resource plunder, direct colonizing, grabbing the riches of the country. Iraq has 113 billion barrels of fine quality crude. You know, at $50 a barrel, we're talking about close to, $4 to $5 trillion. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that's not a narrow economic interest. $5 trillion is the biggest oil grab in the history of the world. It's a humongous, broad interest. So, what the empire does is it teaches our fellow citizens to have a competitive, nationalistic, egoistic view of the virtues of their country, and it teaches them to live in fear. Fear of internal menaces, fear of external menaces. Let me read to you, and this is an old ploy of empires. Let me read to you, and I got the quote in my book on Julius Caesar, which is more than just about Julius Caesar, about the whole late Republic and the class struggles of the late Republic. This was written about ancient Rome. This was written by a conservative economist named Joseph Schumpeter. And he wrote it in 1919. So keep this in mind. He wrote this in 1919 about ancient Rome. He says about Roman imperialism, Rome pursued that policy which pretends to aspire to peace, but unerringly generates war. The policy of continual preparation for war. The policy of meddlesome interventionism. There was no corner of the known world where some interest was not alleged to be in danger or under actual attack. If the interests were not Roman, they were those of Rome's allies. And if Rome had no allies, then allies would be invented. The fight was always invested with an aura of legality. Rome was always being attacked by evil-minded neighbors, always fighting for a breathing space. The whole world was pervaded by a host of enemies, and it was manifestly Rome's duty to guard against their aggressive designs. They were enemies who only waited to fall upon the Roman people. Does any of that sound familiar? John Forster Dulles. John Forster Dulles was a millionaire corporate lawyer for Brown and Harriman Brothers. He and his brother, Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was head of the CIA. Also a rich corporate lawyer, both of them. And Allen Dulles went from his rich corporate law firm to head the CIA. Allen Dulles was Secretary of State under Dwight Eisenhower back in the 1950s. And you know, sometimes I argue that sometimes words speak louder than actions. Because we can see these actions, but when you're trying to determine intent, and they actually say it, they admit their manipulation and their disingenuousness, then the words become rather precious, you know. This is what Dulles said in a moment of committing truth here about the empire's need for falsehood and manipulation. Quote, in order to bring a nation to support the burdens of maintaining great military establishments throughout the world, it's necessary to create an emotional state akin to war psychology. There must be the portrayal of external menace. This involves the development to a high degree of a hero nation and a villain nation ideology, and the arousing of the population to a sense of sacrifice. Once these exist, we have gone a long way on the path to war. So that he's describing imperialist mythology in the service of class power. Well, there are some glimmers of hope through this murky, dark picture I've been painting. We had, you know, that phenomenal thing in February 2003, where millions of people, estimated over 10 million people all around the world, February 15, 2003, demonstrated in perfect coordination all around the world against the U.S. war in Iraq that hadn't even started. Now, I've been to more anti-war demonstrations than I care to count, and this is the first time I saw people demonstrating with such widespread numbers and militancy before the bombs had ever started falling. And you look where these demonstrations took place: Japan, Finland, Lithuania, Spain, Italy, Nigeria, Egypt, Turkey, Mexico, Canada, the U.S. I mean, countries like some of those countries, most of those countries, Japan, Mexico, Canada, Argentina, these are not countries that have a close ethnic or historical or cultural link to Iraq, not at all. And yet they were demonstrating for two reasons. One, out of regard for the Iraqi people. But two, out of regard for themselves. They were saying to U.S. rulers, you cannot appoint yourself as rulers of the planet. You cannot exercise the power of divine monarchy to wage war whenever you want, to decide, to choose who shall live and who shall die. We will now attack you in a preventive or preemptive war because we think you might not be so friendly to us. They were fighting then for their own national sovereignty, for their own democratic sovereignty, for their own right to be left alone, the greatest basic human right of all, the right to be left in peace without being victimized by the violence of others. They were saying that because you have this unanswerable military power, it doesn't give you license to act like you're the rulers of the world in violation of all international law, of all international treaties, and all human rights standards. So that was a remarkable thing, and that's still there. That, in fact, was one of the reasons Rumsfeld kept sitting on those generals and hitting them down and saying, no, we're going in with a smaller force. No, we got to go in with a lighter foot. No, we got to. Seymour Hersh documented all that in the New Yorker a year ago. What's to stop us? There's no Soviet Union backing Cuba anymore. We got the guns, we got the firepower, we could go in. But given the cost of this war, given the fact that now they're stretched so thin, and this may be the Achilles heel of this empire, its ground forces, it really is stretched very thin. They have, in fact, a hidden conscription by extending the enlistments of these reserves and guardsmen and such. The call-up of new reserves and guardsmen, about 1/3 have refused to answer or respond. And this may be an area where the anti-war movement should be organizing. Besides just having big demonstrations, we should really maybe be organizing, giving backup and encouragement to reservists and guardsmen who do not want to go in to go kill people in Iraq. This is what we did during the Vietnam War. Get them. If enough numbers do that, they don't get prosecuted. It's just too many. And the other thing that's happening is enlistments in the regular army are down, in this volunteer regular army. They really are in a bind. They're going to have to go for a draft, I think, eventually. Enlistments are down. Enlistments were down before September 11. And there was no spike after September 11. One expected, all sorts of people would go in to go fight terrorism or something like that. It didn't go up. And they've just been down. They haven't dramatically dropped. They've been rather low anyway. So they're having trouble getting enough of the blood. They get the money from us, but they're having trouble getting enough of the blood to go fight these wars. Which means that when they attack, if and when they attack Iran, it'll be mostly an aerial war of attrition, as in Yugoslavia. They'll just bomb it and bomb it and bomb it and destroy its infrastructure to kill many tens of thousands of people and bring it to its knees without going in. But the reason they go in, the reason they send troops in, the reason they want to occupy is because of what's in the country. Iran has, right after Iraq, the world's largest oil reserve. It's Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Iran. I mean, of usable crude. I mean, you got a bigger reserve in Alberta, Canada, but it's got too much sand in it, and it's too expensive and too near worthless. But usable quality stuff, I don't really know what they're going to do. I really don't know what they're going to do in Iraq with this election that Bush says he's determined to have. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, isn't it interesting that a couple of months ago when Kerry was ahead in the polls, Bush's appointee Tom Ridge gets up and says, if there's an act of terrorism, we might have to postpone the November elections. And a lot of us were saying, what act of terrorism of what magnitude would call for postponing throughout the entire country the elections? What would happen? Would you bomb something, or trains, or something gets hit? And why would then postponing it to December, which influences your turnout rate, especially among low-income voters and such, it represses the turnout rate. Why in December would we be any safer from terrorist acts than we were in November 2nd? So there's all this talk about, well, you know, if it's not safe, we can't have these elections. But here in Iraq, the same president is saying, we're going to have these elections. Iraq, you can't go down the block without risking getting your foot blown off or something. And yet they're determined to have the elections. They're determined to have the elections in Afghanistan, national elections in Afghanistan, better known as the northwest side of Kabul. That's where the elections will take place. Okay, I've been going on too long. We have to organize and give backup to the people who are being conscripted and being lured into the empire's army. We have to continue our agitation to create a climate of opinion and conflict. People who say the Vietnamese anti-war movement didn't accomplish anything, they pursued that war. Oh boy, it did. It created a pressure. It was the only restraint against Richard Nixon from using nuclear weapons. And that's all come out now, where that whole discussion with him and Kissinger, he says, oh, Henry, I want to use the nuclear, just finish them off and nuke the bastards. And Henry says, oh, that'd be too mean and too horrible. And Kissinger said, no, Kissinger has any moral scruples about nuking anybody? He says, no, Mr. President, it would just, you would go down as a maniac and it would just cause too much disruption and dissent at home. It would be too destabilizing around the world. So, you see, they do wonder and they do fear. Don't for a minute, brothers and sisters, don't think that they're not concerned about what you think or how you feel. And we got to organize and get that known. We've got to work. We've got to get behind the Democratic Party for this election, even if the Democratic Party is less than perfect and less than what you want. We have to vote in somebody who himself is an avowed imperialist. It's admitted, but he may give us an opening. I'm talking about Kerry. He may give us an opening, and it may at least stop this reactionary force we're facing. These are not conservatives who are in office. These guys are reactionaries. A conservative is someone who opposes any reform because it might infringe on his privileges. These guys are going for all sorts of what they call reforms, rollbacks. They are going for the third worldization of the entire world, and America included. They are going for an America where there are no public services, no public pension funds, no public education, no public medical care. They're going for a country where there's no labor unions or protections or regulations, no environmental protections. This Bush has shredded every environmental law one way or the other through administrative edicts and executive orders and non-enforcement and misinterpretations and this deliberate misinterpretations. So I know the Democratic Party is not your dream. To me, when I think of the Democratic Party, I always think of Oscar Wilde. When Oscar Wilde came to America, people said to him, when he landed in New York, they said, oh, you got to go up to Niagara Falls. It's where all the newlyweds go. It's beautiful. It's one of the wonders of the world. Oscar Wilde took this train all the way up to Niagara Falls. He took one look at Niagara Falls and he said, Niagara Falls is the second greatest disappointment that American brides experience on their honeymoons. And that's the way I feel about the Democratic Party. It's the second greatest disappointment that I experienced. I mean, the Republicans are the first, of course. But so we're getting screwed and not very well at that. But it's still as I said, don't think for a minute they don't care about what you think. That's all they care about. They're constantly monitoring you. They're constantly directing their propaganda against you. Everything we talked about tonight is about their campaigns to develop and hold to the national consciousness and awareness of what's happening. They're constantly manipulating the information sources. They're constantly trying to create and recreate the climate of opinion. They're constantly sloganizing and propagandizing us. We have to develop a counter consciousness and awareness. They know better than a lot of our own people. They know how powerful you really are. They know that they're standing on your shoulders. And they know that if the people ever really wake and shrug and organize and push, it doesn't even have to be all of them, but just substantial numbers. They know how shaky things get up there. So when the people are ready to lead, the leaders will eventually follow, or they will be thrown aside, as many of them deserve to be. Thank you very much. Salute. I just want to